Spring 1945, and peace returned to Britain after half a decade of destruction and death. In London, the Sadler's Wells Theatre, closed since the Blitz, reopened with a new production, the first opera to be composed by Benjamin Britten.
Britain unleashed on the world at Sadler's Wells this new opera, which sort of changed everything in terms of the British cultural landscape. Peter Grimes.
Everybody was there on the first night. I was seated in the front row. My seat was number A1, and it was a knockout. Peter Grimes was red hot.
The opera's popular success attracted the attention of the BBC, and a whole new audience across the country heard it on the radio.
I had no inclination to switch off, even in the most discordant passages.
The story is grim and sordid and can hardly be called pleasant entertainment, but it is well told.
Britain has arrived with this opera.
This series is the story of British classical music from the Second World War to the present day. The first 20 years of the story were characterised by rivalries between composers of genius, by the rise of extraordinary and influential performers, and by an audience hungry for new experiences in a country searching for a peacetime identity. The pre-war scene had been dominated by the iconic figure of Ralph Vaughan Williams. His evocative landscape pieces that drew deeply from the legacy of folk music had defined a sort of national sound.
He was a great patriot. He believed very deeply in this country, not in a jingoistic way, but he believed in the goodness of its people and the decency of its people, and he was an embodiment of those virtues himself. He said, "We have invented English music. This is our music based on our folk song. It's from our way of life."
And he invited all his friends and gentry of the West.
Listen to that tune. It is one of our English folk tunes. I knew it first when I was quite a small boy, but I realized even then that here was something not only very beautiful, but which had a special appeal to me as an Englishman.
Vaughan Williams had such success and notoriety through the so-called cowpat pieces that he wrote, these kind of beautiful pastoral idyls of a forgotten age, which may never have existed at all, apart from in his head and other people's heads. They're wonderfully evocative pieces, like looking at a bunch of sepia-tinged photographs of Edwardian working men.
The place that Benjamin Britten called home was the landscape of his childhood, the Suffolk coast.
In Suffolk, he found his musical and spiritual home, a beauty almost in its simplicity, like the beach at Albury. I mean, it's just shingle, grey light. All you have there is a canvas upon which to project something. Of course, he projected Peter Grimes onto that.
Peter Grimes!
Peter Grimes himself is an outsider, condemned by society. A strongly individual fisherman, he's classed as a criminal by the prejudices of his own small community.
Shall we go and sink mines in his hut? Popular feelings rising.
And the leading role was written for and sung by his male partner, the tenor Peter Pears.
Picture what that day was like, that evil day.
Pears was Britten's life partner in every sense, and their collaborations, musically speaking, defined Britten's compositional voice. Now we sort of see it as an expression of his pain at not being able to express his sexuality or be fully himself.
Britten and Pears had been pacifists throughout the war and were now a highly visible couple at a time when homosexual acts were still considered as a crime.
Peter Grimes was an incredibly telling metaphor for Britten's own experiences as a gay man, as someone who had opted out of this whole enormous great machine, this thing which was the Second World War. He must have felt very, very outside the accepted norm, which was still very much the world of Vaughan Williams.
The success on every level of this contemporary opera demonstrated that in the wake of Peter Grimes, post-war audiences could expect to identify their own feelings and experiences in modern classical music. And to everyone's surprise, it was Ralph Vaughan Williams, the grand old man of British music, who caught the mood of the age.
When the Sixth Symphony comes in April 1948, and begins with this incredible detonation, it is like nothing Vaughan Williams has written before. He's 75 years old at this stage. This is a shocking piece of music in every sense. This is fluent, original, a brutal representation of how he felt after the Second World War. It is a piece of music really about the aggression of war, about the futility of war. Vaughan Williams is a man who is fearful for his country, fearful for the world. There are sneaking elements of the folk song heritage. That magnificent E major section at the end of the first movement is one of the best folk songs Vaughan Williams ever wrote. It's about a valedictory to an older, nicer world and a brutal representation of what the new world is going to be like. And it ends with this representation of nuclear apocalypse. Malcolm Sargent took the Sixth Symphony to Buenos Aires in 1949, and someone said to him, "Do you think that we'll be able to understand this symphony?" And Sargent said, "Anyone who can't understand Vaughan Williams' Sixth Symphony deserves to be bombed."
It was a typical Malcolm Sargent statement, a headline waiting to happen. No other conductor before or since has drawn as much attention to himself or made such a strong impression on the ordinary public.
The public loved him, you know. I mean, when I was a boy and Sargent conducted the Halle, he was adored by the public and he was adored by the proms audience, and he was no doubt at all a very great personality.
Living up to his nickname, Flash Harry, he brought a rare quality of showmanship to classical music. whether he was opening the 1948 London Olympics, tirelessly promoting his own composition, Impression on a Windy Day,
now he says,
or bringing his own unique style to presenting the proms.
it's turning in itself to us today. August the 10th, 1895, at 8 o'clock in the evening.
The late 1940s were dedicated to the building of a new Britain. Along with the policies for social change and the welfare state, came the concept of high culture being available to all. The BBC launched their third programme, a radio station virtually dedicated to classical music. Audiences had never been as well served before.
Live music, the proms, opera relays like Peter Grimes, they were available at the flick of the switch. Radio was an absolutely mass medium in those days, and that's how classical music got into the bloodstream of this country.
Growing up in the north of England in the years after the war, for Harrison Birtwistle, music was an essential antidote to the drabness of everyday life.
I was born in Accrington in 1934, and my parents had what was called a confectioner's shop, where they baked bread and made cakes. I suppose I was born in another age in a funny way. I was about 7 then, when I was, as it were, given music. We had a military band in Accrington, and my mother said there's somebody plays the flute in the next street, and I think when somebody asked why did she want me to learn the flute, and she said to keep me off the streets. But that was my introduction to music. I remember that the Halley Orchestra came to Blackburn actually, and they played La Promedie d'un Faun, and I was completely knocked out by La Promedie d'un Faun. I just thought it was amazing. Well, I can tell you quite honestly, as soon as I knew music notation, the idea of writing it seemed a really interesting idea.
Inspired by this discovery, Birtwistle was 15 when he composed a short work for piano.
I wrote this piece, you know, and I saw a bird, this white bird, flying, you know, and I didn't know what it was, so I invented this rather sort of mythical bird. And so I gave the name an cooing bird, which I suppose in my mind it could have been a cuckoo, but then I didn't know. Landscapes that you've lived in, you know, they're still in your head. I had a wonderful one when I was in the north of England as a child.
For Benjamin Britten, the landscape of childhood was to assume even greater importance in the wake of the success of Peter Grimes. Here on the edge of the North Sea, he began to build his own musical world, away from the pressure and publicity glare of London.
The sense of slightly removing himself from the mainstream of society was kind of telling. What he needed was to create an environment, a very kind of private, secluded, and kind of ego-massaging environment within which he could create great work.
His work rate now became prodigious, a new opera every year, plus dozens of other works. Many of them premiered at his own newly established festival in the small seaside town of Aldborough, where Grimes had been set.
He was very much a man of his county, having been brought up there, and I think the place he lived in was of tremendous importance to him as a composer. He was a man of Suffolk, and it entered into everything he did.
The project in Aldborough was not just a musical one, but from the start it's really to connect with people and to make him as a composer part of that community in Aldborough and contributing to the social and artistic development of that whole community.
What matters to us now is that people want to use our music. For that, as I see it, is our job, to be useful and to the living.
To this end, he now surrounded himself with a select group of talented and sympathetic musicians and singers.
He got to know his people very well, knew our capabilities and exploited them, which of course is what Mozart did in his day particularly. He wrote things for particular people or cast them in various ways which brought out their best.
The 50s were a time for festivals. A new Britain was under construction, and progress, modernity and culture were all things to be celebrated.
The enormous enthusiasm for the arts really came into its own in 1951, this huge symbolic event of the Festival of Britain. It said the British can move on and create something that is of an excitement and a forward-looking nature.
For Benjamin Britten, the festival brought a commission for a new opera, Billy Budd. He chose his subject with care. Inside the closed community of an 18th century warship, innocence and optimism are destroyed by brutality and malice.
Perhaps what he was responding to in British society at the time was a sense of the individual and the individual's place in society, rather than just a kind of a slavish adherence to social mores and sort of national philosophies.
The work was hailed as another masterpiece from the country's leading composer. Britain had raised the stakes again. Every new triumph of Benjamin Britten's was a reminder to William Walton that his own once glittering career seemed to have stalled. Back in the 20s, he'd acquired a reputation as the bad boy of British music, with witty, inventive pieces that caught the sardonic mood of the times.
I think everybody was amazed by the success of Peter Grimes, and that stirred him up to do likewise, not necessarily to rival it, but to show that he could do it as well.
Leaving the British music scene behind, he settled on the Mediterranean island of Ischia with a new wife and an ambitious project that was to occupy him almost exclusively for the next 10 years. An opera that would restore his reputation and rival Peter Grimes.
The critics were the ones who spread the word that William was no good any longer, because he was always writing the same things that he'd always written. They couldn't allow themselves to have William and Ben Britten on the same footing.
Here on Ischia, he was to build the house and gardens he was to live in for the rest of his life, free to concentrate on his opera away from the distractions of London.
The truth was that he did find it hard to write music. He found it hard to commit himself to writing music.
I don't think he had enough inner demons. Living in a hot climate with good food on a beautiful island is most people's idea of a lovely life. Why write music and face the critics?
Parliament Square, 5:45 this morning. Many had never been out so early before, yet here they were, rapidly filling every vantage point.
And just as the coronation of Elizabeth II brought a welcome diversion to the country, it would also provide a welcome diversion for William Woolton.
The Queen, wearing her shimmering white coronation gown, entered the royal state coach in the inner courtyard of her palace.
Commissioned to write ceremonial music for the service in Westminster Abbey, he found that for once, inspiration came easily.
He was very much aware of the importance of a ceremony of that sort, and therefore he could write music that suited the occasion. I mean, the great coronation and this very young lady who was being crowned and all that. He could see what was needed to enhance that situation.
For his rival Britain, now indisputably the major force in British music, there was also a prestigious commission, Gloriana, an opera to be performed at the Royal Opera House in the presence of the newly crowned monarch.
The Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, provides the sumptuous setting for one of the most brilliant of the coronation festivities, the first night of a new British opera. Her Majesty the Queen arrives, accompanied by the Duke of Edinburgh. The Queen's presence is a great honour for the Opera House, for it is more than 200 years since a reigning monarch attended a first performance at Covent Garden.
But things got off on the wrong foot even before the curtain went up.
It started off with the Queen arriving and the national anthem, which was Walton's arrangement of it, and half the orchestra started it and half the orchestra didn't, because half realised that you wait till the royal party is assembled before you start playing, and others started off as soon as she appeared. The result was considerable cacophony, so that didn't get the evening off to a very good start either way.
Welcome, my lord! Sir Robert here, so wise in counsel, will return anon.
It was not a success, critically speaking, and it wasn't a success with audiences either. And he's writing this piece which ought to be a very obvious, very public celebration of all that is great and good about Britain and all that's great and good about the young Queen. And what he actually turns out is a serious, deeply ambiguous reflection on the first Elizabeth and her problematic relationship with her court and with the country.
I never played her and didn't really want to play her because one felt the age group in which Elizabeth was set didn't show all the greatness that she had. His Elizabeth was old, she was hairless, all the rest of it. We should have had the young Elizabeth. But of course, you can't dictate to a composer what he's going to write. That was Elizabeth in his head and in his mind.
It reflects really an insecurity about what it means to be British. And this at the time when Britain was riding the crest of a wave of thinking we're going to look to the future, and you get instead this deeply subversive reflection upon monarchy.
For the first time, Britain had misjudged the mood. And, stung by the criticism, he retreated further into the private world he'd created for himself around Aldborough.
Ben was like a child in many ways. And like a lot of very gifted people, one part of his personality had perhaps suffered and not matured in order to allow this extraordinary gift to develop. Therefore, Ben really was very sensitive to any criticism. I mean, ridiculously so, given his preeminence.
For William Woolton, the moment of truth had arrived. Covent Garden was to stage the long-awaited opera, Troilus and Cressida. It was dedicated to his wife, Susanna.
Well, I hardly noticed, I must say, that he dedicated the work to me. And in fact, it's very lovely because, first of all, I lasted out those 6 years because quite anybody else would have fled.
Now all that hard work in exile would pay off.
Walton obviously thought that he would smash Britain's reputation and would really, win hands down with Troilus and Cressida, but it wasn't that sort of opera, unfortunately.
It was, in fact, a conventional, rather old-fashioned grand opera, a tragic love story set in the heroic days of the Trojan War. Walton knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he little suspected what lay in store.
Well, he couldn't get the singers he wanted for it to start with. There was a long argy-bargy about the casting of it, and he wanted all sorts of people who weren't available. And he wasn't happy with Malcolm Sargent as conductor, who hadn't conducted any opera for years, and they clashed rather.
Malcolm Sargent was an absolute monster because he had no intention of learning the score. He always thought he knew much better than the composer, and he was an idiot, so vain, so full of himself. Oh. Now, I was very, very offended because I had to drive the silly man to his home opposite the Albert Hall. And I was driving the car, and his hand was up my skirt, and I couldn't hit him because I was driving, and also because I thought, God, if I hit him, then perhaps he'd conduct even worse.
The opening night was a brilliant occasion, with a lavish after-show party, but an air of disappointment hung over the evening.
The general feeling was that it'd been a flop, I think, and he was hurt by that for the rest of his life.
Ultimately, Troilus and Cressida is probably deflated by its very self-consciousness to try and do something massive, and that's probably one of his weaknesses, as well as arguably musical weaknesses too. Grimes simply is a better piece, and I think ultimately that's what posterity has shown too.
This is the landscape of post-war Manchester. Heavily bombed by the Nazis, by the early 1950s, it was booming on all fronts, commercial, sporting and cultural, including being home to one of the great British orchestras, the Hallé.
I think I went to every concert that the Hallé Orchestra gave between 1947 and 1956. And that was the most wonderful education. Of course, they had Barbarolli as their chief conductor, who was a miracle.
The audience loved him, and he attracted people to come and listen, and he could put works on that other conductors might have emptied the hall to.
The effect that John Barbarolli had on people growing up in Manchester at that time is enormous. He totally transformed the musical life of that city. Knowing that there was that sort of heritage to experience and then to react against too, so that's a profound influence.
As a teenager growing up in Manchester in the late 40s, Peter Maxwell Davies was a Barbarolli enthusiast.
The Vaughan Williams Antarctic Symphony, I remember going to the very first performance of that, conducted by John Barbarolli. It was a great occasion. I remember being amazed at the way that he got some extraordinary sound effects out of the percussion. And I remember thinking, isn't it wonderful that an orchestra can do those things? I had no idea.
The city was the centre for music education for the north of England. and was home to the Royal Manchester College of Music, where in 1951 Harrison Birtwistle arrived, ostensibly to study the clarinet.
I was officially a clarinetist but a composer in my head. Being subjected to what was called official music making, I couldn't make head or tail of it. I couldn't equate this academic thing that was being taught me and with quite a big lump, a lot of minutes of music I'd written. The important thing was Sandy Gurr coming to Manchester, and I think that he was what's the thing they say in alchemy, the catalyst.
And one came from London, and as one approached Manchester, there was a pall of smoke over the whole city. And if you had a shirt, it was black within a few hours. The college looked like a public lavatory more than a music college. I was generally rebellious at that age and got a bad reputation. If the form teacher said that Beethoven always wrote in 8-bar phrases, I would contradict him and there would be an argument. And Harry Birtwistle came up to me after one of those classes and says, "Are you just pulling his leg, or do you really believe what you say?"
I never heard anybody do that. I mean, you took it for granted when you were at school. Somebody stood at the front and said something, and that was it.
Soon they were joined by another young composer who shared their general attitude of dissatisfaction.
We thought that the establishment was so stupid that there was no point in being angry about it. You just had to get on and do your own thing, which we did. We formed this group, which was Sandy Gurr's idea, New Music Manchester, and we just laughed and enjoyed it and got on with it.
What I was doing was trying to form a sort of Communist Party cadre in the Manchester College. A small group of people who had sort of their own little thing, because although we were very different personalities, we had one thing in common: we disliked the same people.
The group's activities quickly became focused around the composition classes of a progressive tutor, Richard Hall.
I think Richard Hall was a marvellous influence and sparked off, I think that's what he did, he sparked off controversy, original thinking and real musical questioning.
They enlisted collaborators like the ferociously gifted pianist John Ogden.
He was difficult to cope with because he was a genius. And he was also very young, and he used to make paper aeroplanes out of his compositions.
We all knew he had this extraordinary quality of genius. It's the only word for it. I remember we were in a room in the college there in Manchester, and Gurr and I had got a copy of the Boulez's Second Piano Sonata, and we were trying to come to terms with this and play it. Right, you take the left hand there, I'll take the right, see what we make of that. Ogden came into the room, unannounced, and said, "What's this, what's this?" And he sat down at the piano, pushing us both aside, and played it. And Sandy Gurr said, "Well, I could get you a recital in London and you could play that. Nobody else can really play it in this country." And he said, "Ooh, I don't want to play this, I don't like it." Which I thought was typical.
There must have been some amazing astrological phenomenon which should have them all come together. I mean, these were guys who wanted to change things, and were going to use all their energies to do that. It took their absolutely single-minded enthusiasm and single-minded will to, develop their own languages and be themselves in a culture which was telling them not to do that.
What excited all of these disaffected individuals was the new music being created in Europe. Here was radical experimental sonic art, music that resonated in the post-war landscape but looked towards the future. Music that made Vaughan Williams, William Walton, and even Benjamin Britten sound like the past. Music that had virtually no audience in the UK.
Even people who were in the musical world, they were much more fiercely against continental new music than I would have given anybody credit for.
I didn't know the music because nobody played it.
I mean, I don't think anyone was interested. I can't remember anyone who was interested.
I think people thought this isn't quite British, this isn't cricket, which it certainly wasn't. Barbaroli did the Stravinsky Symphony in 3 movements, and there the applause was so short that he could hardly get off stage, and people were saying, isn't this awful, isn't this ridiculous?
The possibility of what you might be able to do was the thing that was exciting. I sat down and I wrote a piece of music absolutely off the top of my head from beginning to end without any reference to anything. It was purely instinctive. I start writing. I don't know what I'm doing. And then it becomes, I know what I'm doing. And then it becomes something. And then it finishes.
The BBC would not broadcast much of this music. There was a policy of great conservatism there. But that was all right. As a young man, it's splendid to have something to fight, isn't it?
The adventurousness of the musical diet was very largely in the music of the past, rather than letting us hear the most adventurous music that was being written on the continent. Malcolm Sargent was at the Proms. He wasn't very committed to new music. He wanted to make the great masterpieces of the past come alive for the audience who he knew would appreciate those things.
I feel myself that the composers who are twisting themselves in knots with strange rhythms, who are tying themselves in knots, not making melodies, perhaps are wasting their time.
The opportunity to have a bit of fun at the expense of the modern music scene was to prove irresistible to an amateur tuba player called Gerard Hoffnung.
Well, now, look, you seem to be obsessed by tubas. Oh, no, I'm not obsessed. Not at all. You've got one at home, haven't you? I've got several at home, yes. Well, what is all that tuba, then? Well, I mean, it's just rather a nice visual thing.
His gently absurd cartoons became a minor sensation in the mid-50s, and in a stroke of genius, he transformed them into a series of legendary concerts given at the Royal Festival Hall.
Well, everybody wanted to take part in the Hoffnung concerts. There were people who found this sort of humour rather irreverent. People were still behaving very, very properly at concerts in 1956, you know. I'm sure we were wearing gloves and putting on our best dresses. But the audience on that first night just exploded with mirth.
Gerard knew this fellow called Malcolm Arnold, who I also knew. He was very much for popular music and very much for cocking a snook at the bosses.
There's always been this part of our culture through music hall and beyond down through the last 100 years, which is slightly subversive, slightly wanting to prick the balloon, which is, you know, some very seriously cherished and highly regarded concept, whatever it may be, which is coming to us across the channel from Europe.
The most fashionable name on the European avant-garde scene was undoubtedly Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Controversial, conceptual, and deadly serious, he was a sitting duck.
Gerard said, any ideas? And I said, well, modern music needs to be taken down a peg, I think. And he said, I heard the other day on Radio Cologne 2 musicologists discussing a new piece of music, and they talked for 55 minutes analysing this piece, and then they played it, and it lasted 3.5 minutes.
Schlagobers, how you say flagellated cream. Nein, whipped cream. Whipped cream. Whipped, all right.
And I wrote the script punct, contrapunct, and we took the mickey out of modern music.
Unlike Stravinsky, has not been guilty that he wrote any harmony in his life, never.
They were marvellous, very strong German accents, very pompous.
Absolute 12 tone.
this sort of very serious speech, saying quite ridiculous things.
The violas have a bottom B flat in this bar.
They must not play the note, they must only think it.
For William Walton, the feeling that he'd been left behind must have been overwhelming. So he seized with both hands the chance to compose a concerto for the leading cellist of his generation, Gregor Piatigorsky, particularly when the new work was due for some very high-profile exposure.
Here, in the presence of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, we are privileged to televise for the first time Sir William Walton's cello concerto.
In the cello concerto, I think his marriage with Susanna and the Italian landscape that he loved got together to produce a marvellous work.
The cello's been very important for many English composers, but Walton's own concerto, I have a particular love for it because it's terribly English. It's very heartfelt, but at the same time, it's got this nature where it feels like it's almost hesitant and it's apologetic. And it's a very English thing. It's when you speak almost in short little hesitant phrases. You say, I wonder, is it possible, could I? And it keeps catching its words and being rather unsure, as if it's somebody rather foppish, kind of hesitating and not quite saying what they mean.
At the beginning, he was the angry young man of music. After Ischia, he was perfectly relaxed. He just thought, this is lovely, I'm doing what I want. You know, many years later, I asked him, why was it that the first time you'd ever seen me and said, you'll be very surprised to hear I am going to marry you. Why? And he said, I had a vision. I saw you in my life. Therefore, it had to happen.
He always knew, I think, through his life, from being a small boy, what was right for him, in the way self-centered and selfish as artists are. But that was what Walton was, and he got what he wanted.
Now, last night, the beloved Vaughan Williams died. It's not easy at short notice, as he was a great friend, a very dear friend of mine, for me to talk of him. All I can say is that he was a man who oozed goodwill, good humour, kindness. He had a halo of goodness around him, which comes through his music as it came from him himself.
The world in which Vaughan Williams was writing in the mid to late 50s, just before his death, at a time of the Cold War. It's not a happy time for the world, and it would be only natural for that to be reflected in his music. By the time of the 9th, which has its premiere only 4 months before his death, he was aware that he'd been around for a long time. It's a very dark piece of music. He said it was based on the end of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, of the bleakness of Salisbury Plain. It's as if he knew he was going to die, and it ends with a final movement of almost relentless progression towards a precipice. It's life almost draining away. It's a piece of music that's almost posthumous. It's amazing he was alive when he wrote it, if you see what I mean. This is a man who, in his last work, writes about the confrontation of the individual with the end, however that end comes.
In London, the generation whose childhood had been blighted by the Second World War began to attract attention with their radical new modern art. The Manchester group were now eager to discover what effect their experimental music might have on the capital's audiences.
We took my trumpet sonata down and did it at a concert at the Arts Council Great Drawing Room. I remember the place was packed to our utter amazement. You couldn't get in. And there was a gentleman standing next to me, and he turned to me, quite pale and stressed, and said, "Who the hell wrote that?"
The battle for the hearts and minds of the audience was now on. And for Malcolm Arnold, speaking to an audience in a language they could understand was vital.
Malcolm Arnold was a very conflicted character. I mean, he was a card-carrying communist, but he also wrote music which is incredibly come hither, come easy, sort of almost like the Light programme type music. Part of the reason why he wrote music that was so kind of easy on the ear was because he passionately believed that that was the best way to engage with the broadest possible audience. This was music that could genuinely speak to everybody.
Arnold had been deeply disturbed by the growing racial tensions in the country.
We want to send them back home to good conditions. I've spoken at meetings where many Negroes were present, and they've agreed with me. They'd much rather be home in their sunshine than in our November fogs.
His Fourth Symphony was a direct response to the 1958 Notting Hill race riots, a week of violence in which gangs of white teddy boys attacked West Indian immigrants in the streets. The symphony blended Caribbean percussion and aggressive brass stabs with a candy-floss Edwardian pop tune.
A lovely little tune, but all the critics, we all mistook it. I gave it a bad notice. I said it was mush, and everybody else gave it a boot.
By creating such music, he was flying in the face of all the other kind of trends in music at the time, which were much more kind of extreme and about playing to, I suppose, a small coterie of converts and to hell with the rest of the world.
On the threshold of the 60s, Harrison Birtwistle finally decided to give up playing the clarinet and devote himself to writing music.
I sort of feel I've always been doing the same thing in a way. And if there's any difference in what I've done, it's evolved rather than changed. I can't be so pretentious as saying I'm going to push music where it's never been. I mean, you can't do that. You can only identify that after the fact. You can't self-consciously express yourself. You express yourself in spite of yourself. You have ideas, and then you find ways of getting it down on the page.
The group had now left Manchester far behind. John Ogden was to go on to demonstrate his genius by winning the prestigious International Tchaikovsky Piano Competition in Moscow. Whilst Peter Maxwell Davis's first orchestral composition, the enigmatically titled Prolation, won him a major European music prize. It was very much the shape of things to come.
For me, it was groundbreaking because I hadn't worked with an orchestra before. I'd never had that palette. I learned a lot from the mistakes I made in that piece. I think one must always learn from one's mistakes. I worked out in that piece structural principles which have been very helpful throughout my whole lifetime. And I felt that this was very important then, in the late 50s particularly, because the whole question of the composition techniques that a composer employs had gone into some kind of melting pot. Tonality, rhythmic structure had disintegrated into something which had to be rethought. It all had to be pulled together and fashioned into something that would stand me in good stead for the next 100 years.
The 60s were a decade where anything seemed possible. In this clean, modern Britain, even World War II was now history, a ghost that could finally be laid to rest. On November the 14th, 1940, German bombers had reduced much of the city of Coventry to rubble. The rebuilding of the city's shattered cathedral had become a hugely symbolic act, and to mark the consecration of the new building, they turned to Benjamin Britten, the country's most successful composer.
The War Requiem allowed Britain to project onto a public stage his private world. He didn't have to compromise on his pacifism, for example. And the piece actually dramatizes that relationship between a private grief and a public grief.
As ever, Britten was to give the work a personal dimension. 4 of his closest friends had been killed in the war.
He was bitterly upset when they departed, and he thought he'd like to dedicate it to them, and also through them to all the thousands who died.
The War Requiem was a monumental work, with a startling text that intercut the Latin Mass with the powerful war poetry of Wilfred Owen. Positioned in the huge space of the new cathedral, there were 3 soloists, 2 choirs and 2 orchestras.
What's so brilliant about it, is that Britten is never bombastic, even though it involves so many people. It's actually one of the most intimate and personal works he ever wrote. One can only imagine, gosh, I would give anything to have been at Coventry Cathedral at that first performance, to have witnessed that.
It just transfixed us. I just stood there, my hair stood on end.
It was certainly very moving. I think that was surely one of the effects that Benjamin Britten himself would have hoped for.
I heard the first performance. I was a little bit appalled in that some people saw that piece as some kind of glorification of the memory of war. And of course, it does make war into a very profoundly moving experience without the horrible physical violence.
At the finish, I'm afraid I was in tears. I think a lot of the audience were, and that explains why there was no clapping. But it wasn't just about the destruction of the cathedral and buildings, it was the destruction of people, really, wasn't it?
What's actually astonishing about the piece is the way that it absolutely caught something that people needed, I think, to hear. It's one of those pieces that you feel in retrospect that was almost waiting to happen, waiting to be expressed.
It was the last genuinely popular piece of classical music that brought the country together in a sense of shared excitement and shared astonishment that the mood of the times could be so precisely captured.
In the next episode of Classic Britannia, the 60s revolution will blow apart every notion anybody had ever held about classical music.